So, Canada just blocked America's pharmaceutical supply chain, and millions of Americans are about to find out their prescription drugs come from a country their president started a trade war with. Prime Minister Carney announced at 8 a.m. this morning that Canada is suspending all pharmaceutical exports to the United States, active ingredients, finished generics, insulin intermediaries, the cross-border pharmacy pipeline, effective in 72 hours. Every American pharmacy chain just got a countdown clock. Trump's response was immediate. And when I tell you what he did, the military orders, the rhetoric, the comparison to a hostile act of war against a NATO ally, you'll understand why the Pentagon pushed back, why NATO headquarters went into emergency session, and why Warren Buffett said something about the American healthcare system that stopped a room full of billionaires cold. When you hear which drugs are affected, how fast the shortages will hit, and what Buffett revealed about the pharmaceutical dependency that nobody in Washington wanted to talk about, you'll understand why healthcare analysts are calling this the most dangerous supply chain crisis since COVID, and why it's about to hit a lot closer to home than any tariff fight ever has. Hit subscribe. This one is personal. So let me walk you through exactly what happened. Carney held the press conference in Ottawa at 8 a.m. Eastern. He stood behind the podium flanked by the health minister on his left and the trade minister on his right, and his tone was something the world has come to recognize from this prime minister: calm, measured, completely devoid of emotion. He said, "Canada has been a reliable pharmaceutical partner to the United States for over 50 years. We have supplied active ingredients, manufactured generic drugs, processed insulin compounds, and provided affordable prescription access to millions of American citizens. We did this as partners, as neighbors, as allies, but we cannot continue to supply the healthcare needs of a nation whose government treats us as an economic adversary." The legal mechanism is something most Americans have never heard of. 2 months ago, Canada quietly passed the Essential Goods Sovereignty Act, emergency legislation giving the Prime Minister authority to restrict exports of goods deemed essential to Canadian national interest. It barely made the news in the United States. Nobody on Capitol Hill paid attention. Nobody in the White House flagged it. 2 months later, it just became the most consequential piece of legislation in North American trade relations. The scope of the suspension is total: active pharmaceutical ingredients, finished generic medications, insulin intermediary compounds, bulk chemical precursors, cross-border pharmacy shipments. Every category of pharmaceutical export from Canada to the United States suspended in 72 hours. Not reduced, not renegotiated, suspended. Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He read the statement, took 3 questions, and left. The restraint was the point. This wasn't emotional. It was surgical. The market reaction was immediate and violent. Pharmaceutical stocks cratered within minutes of the announcement. Major generics manufacturers dropped 8 to 12% before noon. CVS, Walgreens, and Rite Aid all issued emergency statements about supply chain contingency planning. Hospital systems across the northern United States, New York, Michigan, Minnesota, Maine, activated shortage protocols. The American Pharmacists Association released an emergency advisory listing 47 critical drugs at immediate risk of shortage. Within an hour of the announcement, hospital procurement officers across the northern half of the country were on the phone with every alternative supplier they could find. India, Ireland, Israel, the other major pharmaceutical exporting nations all got calls. Most of those calls ended the same way: "We can't replace Canadian supply, not at this volume, not at this speed." India's generic pharmaceutical industry could theoretically scale up, but the lead time is months, not days. Ireland's pharmaceutical sector is dominated by big pharma facilities producing patented brand-name drugs, not the generic APIs that American manufacturers depend on. Israel's Teva could redirect some supply, but not nearly enough to close the gap. The math simply doesn't work. Canada's pharmaceutical supply chain wasn't one option among many. It was the foundation. And here's the detail that makes this even more unsettling. The 72-hour window Carney announced isn't a negotiating window. It's a logistics window. It gives American distributors exactly enough time to place emergency orders on whatever existing inventory Canadian companies still have in transit, shipments already on trucks, already at airports, already in the pipeline. But it's not enough time to find, qualify, and onboard alternative suppliers. 72 hours is enough to panic. It's not enough to adapt, and that asymmetry was clearly intentional. Now, this is Carney's direct response to Trump's latest tariff escalation. A 35% surcharge on Canadian manufactured goods announced the previous week. But Canada didn't do this without warning. There were 3 separate diplomatic communications over 2 months, each escalating in severity. The first was polite. The second was firm. The third was explicit. If the tariffs on manufactured goods proceed, we will restrict pharmaceutical exports. The tariffs proceeded. The restriction followed. Nobody in Washington can say they weren't warned. But the tariff escalation was just the trigger. The real reason Canada could do this, the reason this weapon exists at all, is something most Americans have never heard of. And once you understand the pharmaceutical dependency that's been building for decades, you'll understand why this crisis was always inevitable. Let's start with active pharmaceutical ingredients, because this is where the whole thing begins. APIs are the raw chemical compounds that become finished drugs, the actual active molecules that make your medication work. Without the API, there is no pill, there is no injection, there is no treatment. It's the difference between medicine and a sugar tablet. Canada is the largest processor of active pharmaceutical ingredients in North America. Facilities in Montreal, Toronto, and Calgary handle API purification and formulation for dozens of generic drugs sold in American pharmacies. Apotex, the Canadian generics giant, the largest pharmaceutical company in Canada and one of the largest generics manufacturers in the world, supplies API compounds to dozens of American drug manufacturers. When Apotex stops shipping, the American companies that buy those compounds can't make finished pills. The production lines slow. Then they stop. And these aren't specialty drugs for rare conditions. These are the most prescribed medications in the United States. Metformin, 90 million American prescriptions per year for diabetes management. Lisinopril, 104 million prescriptions per year for blood pressure. Atorvastatin, 94 million prescriptions per year for cholesterol. Amoxicillin, one of the most commonly prescribed antibiotics in the country. These are the drugs that half of American adults over 50 take every single day. And the active ingredients come from Canada. Think about that. The blood pressure pill your father takes every morning. The diabetes medication your mother depends on. The cholesterol drug your doctor says you can't skip. The raw ingredients for those pills were processed in a Canadian facility that just got a 72-hour shutdown order. But that's not even the most terrifying part. Because now we need to talk about insulin. 37 million Americans have diabetes. Of those, 8.4 million require insulin to survive. Not to manage symptoms, not to improve quality of life, to survive. Without insulin, a type 1 diabetic can go into diabetic ketoacidosis within days and die within weeks. This is not a lifestyle medication. This is a lifeline. Novo Nordisk's Canadian manufacturing facility in Mississauga, Ontario, produces insulin products distributed throughout the North American market. Eli Lilly sources critical intermediary compounds from Canadian pharmaceutical suppliers. Sanofi's Canadian operations feed directly into the continental insulin supply chain. These three companies control the vast majority of the global insulin market, and all three have significant Canadian dependencies. Current U.S. insulin inventory sits at approximately 4 to 6 weeks of supply at normal distribution rates. If Canadian insulin exports stop for 72 hours, hospitals start rationing within 3 weeks. If they stop for 30 days, people start dying. That is not hyperbole. That is not speculation. That is what endocrinologists are telling the Department of Health and Human Services right now. The American insulin market has no rapid alternative. Domestic production capacity covers roughly 40% of demand. The rest is imported, with Canada as the primary North American source. There is no switch to flip. There is no backup supplier sitting in a warehouse waiting for a phone call. The dependency is structural, physical, and immediate. America does not make enough insulin to keep its own diabetics alive. That is the sentence that should terrify every policymaker in Washington. And until this morning, almost none of them knew it. And the cruelty of an insulin shortage is that it doesn't hit everyone equally. Wealthy diabetics will stockpile. They'll pay whatever it costs. They'll fly to Europe if they have to. But the single mother in Toledo making $38,000 a year, already paying $300 a month out of pocket for her son's insulin, she can't stockpile. She can't fly to Europe. She can't absorb a price spike. She's the one who shows up at the pharmacy and hears the words no parent of a diabetic child ever wants to hear. We're on back order. We don't know when it's coming in. That's not an economic statistic. That's a mother standing in a CVS trying not to cry. And there are 8.4 million stories like that across this country. Each one a person whose life depends on a supply chain that just got severed by a trade war they had no voice in. Each one now counting their remaining vials and doing the math on how many days they have left. And then there's the cross-border pharmacy pipeline, the one that hits the most vulnerable Americans hardest. Millions of Americans, especially seniors, uninsured workers, and underinsured families, buy their prescription drugs from Canadian pharmacies because the exact same medications cost 50 to 80% less across the border. States like Florida, Maine, Vermont, Colorado, and New Hampshire have formal state-authorized Canadian drug importation programs. The informal market is even larger. Online Canadian pharmacies serving millions of American customers who simply cannot afford American drug prices. When Carney shut down pharmaceutical exports, he didn't just threaten hospital supply chains. He cut off the affordable drug pipeline that millions of Americans, most of them elderly, most of them on fixed incomes, depend on to afford their medication. These are people who drive to Windsor or order from Canadian pharmacies because they literally cannot afford what American pharmacies charge. A retired teacher in Bangor, Maine, making $1,800 a month on Social Security, paying $420 a month for 3 prescriptions at a U.S. pharmacy, or $86 for the same drugs from a Canadian pharmacy in New Brunswick. That's the difference between eating and not eating, between heating the house and not heating the house. And that lifeline just went dark. The cross-border pharmacy trade exists for one reason. The same pill made by the same company with the same active ingredients costs dramatically less in Canada because Canadian law allows the government to negotiate drug prices. American law does not. So Americans who can't afford American prices drive north or click a Canadian website. It's not a loophole. It's a survival strategy. And now it's gone. Now, Warren Buffett responded to all of this, and his reaction was unlike anything we've heard from him in this entire trade war saga. He was at a healthcare industry conference in Omaha. Berkshire Hathaway has significant healthcare holdings, so Buffett stays engaged with the sector. When a moderator asked him about the Canadian pharmaceutical blockade, he paused. A long pause, uncharacteristic for a man who always has a folksy anecdote or a sharp one-liner ready. And then he said this, "You know, I've talked a lot this year about capital flows and trade balances and investment confidence, numbers. I'm comfortable with numbers. But this isn't about numbers anymore. This is about a 67-year-old woman in Dayton, Ohio, who needs insulin to stay alive and whose supply just became a bargaining chip in a tariff dispute. I don't have a folksy way to say this. That's morally obscene. Morally obscene." Those are the 2 strongest words Warren Buffett has used in the entirety of this trade conflict. Not strategically unwise. Not economically irrational. Morally obscene. The Oracle of Omaha, the man famous for reducing everything to balance sheets and compound interest, just made a moral judgment. And the room went silent. He continued, "How did we get here? How did the most powerful country on earth end up dependent on a neighbor for its own medicine supply? I'll tell you how. We spent 30 years letting pharmaceutical companies offshore production to wherever the margins were highest. We let the supply chain stretch across borders because it was cheaper. We celebrated the efficiency. And nobody, not one president, not one Congress, not one health secretary ever asked the question, what happens if that supply gets cut off?" He paused again. "Well, now we know." But then Buffett pivoted. And this is where it got pointed. Now, every president before this one managed to maintain the relationship with the country that supplies our medicine. It took a trade war to turn a supply chain vulnerability into a supply chain crisis. The vulnerability existed for decades. The crisis was manufactured in 18 months. And then he said something about Trump's response that encapsulated the entire absurdity of what was about to unfold. I heard about the president's response, the National Guard, the Defense Production Act, the rhetoric about hostile military action. And I thought, this is what happens when you don't understand supply chains. You can't point a soldier at a pharmaceutical compound. You can't invoke emergency powers and make insulin appear. The only way to get Canadian pharmaceutical exports flowing again is to sit down with Canada and negotiate. Everything else is theater. Dangerous, expensive, alliance-destroying theater. He finished with this. "I've said hard things this year. I've used words like obituary and demolish, but this is different. When your trade policy starts threatening people's access to medicine, when a diabetic in Ohio or a cancer patient in Michigan becomes a casualty of a tariff dispute, you've crossed a line. And I don't know how you come back from that." That last sentence landed differently than anything Buffett has said before. In previous statements throughout this trade war, he's been clinical, professorial, mournful, even cautiously hopeful. He's diagnosed capital flight, mapped economic dependency, mourned the erosion of American leadership. But I don't know how you come back from that. That's bewilderment. That's a 94-year-old man who has seen every economic cycle, every crisis, every boom and bust that American capitalism has produced over the last 7 decades, admitting he doesn't have a framework for what's happening now. Not because the economics are unprecedented, supply chain disruptions happen, but because the moral dimension is unprecedented. A trade war causing pharmaceutical shortages that threaten human lives. In his experience, that has never happened between allied nations, and it shouldn't have happened now. The room at the conference, healthcare executives, hospital administrators, pharmaceutical industry leaders, was completely still. Several people later described it as the moment the trade war stopped being an economic story and became a human story. Buffett had made it personal. A 67-year-old woman in Dayton, not a GDP statistic, not a market indicator, a person. And when the most respected capitalist in America tells a room full of healthcare billionaires that what's happening to that woman is morally obscene, something shifts. The framing changes. The conversation changes. You can't go back to talking about trade balances after that. Now let's talk about what Trump did. Because Buffett was right. It was theater, but it was also dangerous. Trump's response came at 2:15 p.m. Eastern, 6 hours after Carney's announcement. He held a press conference in the Rose Garden flanked by the Secretary of Defense on one side and the Secretary of Health and Human Services on the other. The staging alone told you this was going to be different. This wasn't a trade response, this was being framed as a national security response. He announced 3 actions simultaneously. First, a National Guard deployment to the northern border, 3,200 troops ordered to staging areas along the New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington state borders. The stated mission protecting American health security interests. Second, an invocation of the Defense Production Act ordering American pharmaceutical companies to maximize domestic production immediately. Third, and this is the one that sent shockwaves through every embassy in Washington, a formal diplomatic classification of Canada's pharmaceutical export ban as an act of economic warfare equivalent to a hostile military action against the American people. Think about what you just heard. The President of the United States just compared Canada, America's closest ally, the longest undefended border in the world, a NATO founding partner, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a country that has fought alongside American soldiers in every major conflict since the First World War, to a hostile military adversary. Because Canada stopped shipping pills. The National Guard deployment was designed for one audience, television cameras. Soldiers at the border looks decisive. It looks strong. It looks like a president taking action. But it doesn't produce a single milligram of insulin. It doesn't restart a single API shipment. It doesn't unclog a single supply chain bottleneck. Military analysts pointed out within hours that there is no supply chain infrastructure to protect at the border. Pharmaceutical exports flow through commercial shipping, air cargo, and truck freight, not through checkpoints that soldiers can guard. You can't intercept a pharmaceutical supply chain disruption with camouflage and rifles. It's a photo op dressed up as a policy. Pentagon sources were reportedly deeply uncomfortable with the order. The northern border between the United States and Canada has been demilitarized since the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, over 200 years ago. 200 years of peace across the longest undefended border in the history of the modern world. 2 centuries of mutual trust, shared defense, integrated economies, and it just got soldiers. Soldiers who can't do anything about the problem they were sent to address. The imagery alone was devastating to American credibility. Canadian media broadcast the deployment live, split screen with footage of the actual pharmaceutical facilities that supply American hospitals, clean, orderly laboratories, staffed by scientists in white coats. On one side, soldiers in tactical gear guarding an empty stretch of border. On the other, the Canadian pharmacists and chemists who actually make the medicine America needs. The contrast said everything words couldn't. The Defense Production Act invocation was even more revealing. Not for what it accomplished, but for what it exposed. Trump ordered American pharmaceutical manufacturers to surge domestic production. The problem is that American manufacturers can't surge production because they depend on Canadian active pharmaceutical ingredients to make the drugs. It's like ordering a bakery to make more bread while cutting off their flour supply. The oven works fine, the recipe is ready, but there's no flour, and the flour is in Canada. The Defense Production Act is a powerful tool. It was used brilliantly during COVID to ramp up ventilator and vaccine production. But it works by directing existing manufacturing capability toward urgent needs. If the raw materials aren't there, they act as just a piece of paper with a presidential signature on it. And the raw materials are sitting in Canadian facilities that just received shutdown orders. Pharmaceutical industry executives reportedly explained this to the White House within hours of the announcement. One CEO of a major generics manufacturer reportedly told a senior advisor, "You're asking us to make pills without ingredients. We physically cannot do what you're ordering us to do. This isn't a capacity problem, this is a chemistry problem. The molecules we need are in Canada." The response from senior aides, according to multiple reports, the president wants action, not excuses. The people who actually understand pharmaceutical supply chains told the White House this wouldn't work. The White House told them to make it work anyway. That's not leadership, that's denial. And the Defense Production Act failure reveals something deeper about the entire America First framework. The premise of the trade war was that America is self-sufficient, that it doesn't need Canada, doesn't need foreign supply chains, can go it alone. The pharmaceutical blockade just demolished that premise in the most visceral way possible. America can't even make its own medicine without Canadian ingredients. The country that proclaimed it didn't need its neighbor can't keep its own diabetics alive without that neighbor's cooperation. If there's a more devastating rebuttal to economic nationalism, nobody has found it. And then there's the rhetoric, the hostile military action language, which may end up being the most damaging element of all. NATO headquarters in Brussels called an emergency consultation within 2 hours of Trump's statement. The concern wasn't about Canada, the concern was about what this language means for every other alliance the United States maintains. If America classifies Canada, its closest, most trusted, most deeply integrated ally, as equivalent to a hostile military actor over a pharmaceutical export dispute, what does that mean for Japan, for Germany, for Australia, for the United Kingdom? What does it mean for any country that has an economic disagreement with Washington? Japan, Germany, Australia, and the UK all issued statements within hours expressing what diplomats call concern, which in diplomatic language means alarm, but the private communications were far blunter than the public statements. According to European diplomatic sources, the German Foreign Ministry sent a classified cable to all EU member states warning that the United States can no longer be considered a predictable partner in trade disputes and recommending that European nations accelerate pharmaceutical supply chain diversification away from American-dependent networks. Japan's trade ministry reportedly convened an emergency meeting to assess whether Japanese pharmaceutical companies with American manufacturing operations should begin contingency planning for politically motivated supply chain disruptions. When you call your closest ally a hostile military actor over a pharmaceutical export dispute, you haven't just damaged one relationship. You've told every ally on Earth that their alliance with the United States is conditional, fragile, and one trade dispute away from being classified as hostility. Every ambassador in Washington heard that message. Every foreign ministry in the world updated their threat assessments. And the cascading effect is something no National Guard deployment can contain, because the damage isn't at the border. It's in the confidence of every nation that ever trusted the United States to be a rational partner. The fallout is already cascading through every system that touches pharmaceutical supply. Within 24 hours of Carney's announcement, hospital procurement systems across the northern United States activated shortage protocols. The Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, and Mass General all issued internal memos about potential drug rationing timelines. Generic antibiotic supplies 3 to 4 weeks of inventory at current usage rates. Insulin 4 to 6 weeks before rationing becomes necessary. Chemotherapy compounds with Canadian-sourced APIs, some as little as 2 weeks of supply. A cancer patient at Memorial Sloan Kettering doesn't care about tariff policy. They care about whether their next chemotherapy infusion is going to be available. And right now, the procurement team at that hospital cannot guarantee it will be. Let that land for a moment. We're not talking about trade deficits or GDP projections or stock market fluctuations. We're talking about whether a cancer patient gets their treatment, whether a diabetic gets their insulin, whether a child with an ear infection gets antibiotics. That's what this trade war just became. CVS announced it would begin limiting prescription quantities, 30-day supplies only, no 90-day refills until further notice. Walgreens activated its critical shortage contingency for the first time since COVID. State-authorized Canadian importation programs in Florida, Maine, and Vermont all frozen. Millions of seniors who depended on affordable Canadian drugs are now facing full American prices overnight. A 90-day supply of brand-name insulin in the United States cost approximately $900. The same supply from a Canadian pharmacy cost $120. That $780 difference per quarter is now hitting the budgets of retired Americans on fixed incomes. People who structured their entire financial lives around the assumption that they could get their medication affordably from across the border. The people hurt worst by this aren't wealthy. They're not politically powerful, they're not connected, they're elderly people on Social Security who crossed the border or ordered online to afford their medication. And they just became collateral damage in a trade war they had no part in starting. NATO's emergency consultation resulted in a joint statement urging immediate de-escalation and diplomatic resolution. Canada's NATO ambassador reportedly told the session that Canada is not a hostile actor, that it is a sovereign nation exercising control over its own exports in response to economic aggression, and that if the United States wants pharmaceutical exports to resume, the path is negotiation, not National Guard deployments. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, the most sensitive and closely guarded intelligence alliance in the world, binding the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, is now under strain in ways that intelligence officials describe as unprecedented. Australia's Prime Minister publicly stated that militarizing a trade dispute with your closest ally is not the behavior of a reliable partner. Every alliance America has built since 1945 is based on a single premise. The United States does not treat its allies as enemies. Trump just violated that premise. Not with Russia, not with China, not with Iran or North Korea, with Canada, and every other ally noticed. The domestic political reaction was almost as damaging. Republican senators from border states, New York, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington, were flooded with calls from constituents who suddenly realized their prescription drugs were at risk. Senator Lisa Murkowski issued a statement calling the National Guard deployment a misuse of military resources that does nothing to address the actual crisis. 3 Republican House members from Michigan held a joint press conference demanding immediate negotiations with Ottawa. One of them said something that cut to the heart of it. "My constituents don't need soldiers at the border. They need insulin at their pharmacy. Those are different problems with different solutions." Even Fox News hosts struggled to defend the response. One anchor asked a White House spokesperson on air, "Can you explain how National Guard troops at the border will help a diabetic in Iowa get her insulin?" The spokesperson pivoted to talking points about national security. The anchor asked the question again. The spokesperson pivoted again. The clip went viral, not because of the question, but because of the absence of an answer. The diplomatic channels between Ottawa and Washington are described as open but frozen. Canada has stated clearly that it will not negotiate while National Guard troops are deployed at the border. Carney's conditions are straightforward. Full tariff rollback on Canadian manufactured goods plus withdrawal of Guard deployments equals pharmaceutical exports resume within 48 hours. Trump's position, no rollback, no withdrawal, pharmaceutical exports must resume unconditionally or further actions will follow. There's a simple deal available. Remove the tariffs. Remove the soldiers. The medicine flows. Carney has said it plainly, publicly, with no ambiguity. The pharmaceutical exports resume within 48 hours of a tariff rollback and Guard withdrawal. That's it. That's the entire negotiation. No hidden demands. No complex framework. Just stop the trade war and the medicine comes back. But that deal requires Trump to admit the tariffs were a mistake. And we've established across dozens of examples that admitting a mistake is the one thing this president cannot do. His entire brand, political, personal, psychological, is built on the premise that he never backs down, never apologizes, never concedes. Every previous off-ramp in this trade war has been rejected for the same reason, not because the terms were unacceptable, because accepting terms means acknowledging error. And for this president, acknowledging error is existentially impossible. So the hospitals plan for rationing. The pharmacies limit prescriptions, the seniors calculate whether they can afford their medication at American prices. Endocrinologists start making lists of which patients get insulin first if supply drops below critical thresholds. Oncologists start having conversations with patients about whether their next round of chemotherapy can be guaranteed. And the clock keeps ticking. This isn't like the other trade war stories. This isn't about factories or farms or shipping lanes or diplomatic standing, although it touches all of those things too. This is about medicine, your family's medicine, the pills in your cabinet, the prescriptions at your pharmacy, the treatments in your hospital. A trade war that started with tariffs on steel just reached into your medicine cabinet. And the president's response isn't negotiation. It's soldiers at the border. How long before drug shortages move from procurement memos to empty pharmacy shelves? And what happens to the millions of Americans who can't afford to stockpile? Can Trump's military posturing survive the reality that you cannot force a sovereign nation to ship you medicine at gunpoint? And what happens when the National Guard deployments accomplish nothing? And the question Buffett couldn't answer with his usual confidence, when a trade policy starts threatening people's access to medicine, how do you come back from that? What's the apology? What's the fix? What do you say to the family in Ohio whose insulin supply just became a bargaining chip? The tariffs were supposed to make America stronger. The pharmaceutical blockade just proved how vulnerable those tariffs made America instead. Canada didn't need to send a single soldier. They didn't need to fire a single shot. They just stopped shipping medicine. And the most powerful country on earth is now scrambling to figure out how to keep its own people healthy without the help of the neighbor it picked a fight with. The clock is ticking. 72 hours and counting.